Secret of Evermore on the Super Nintendo was an attempt by a talented team of developers in Redmond, Washington, to put a distinctly American spin on the popular genre of Japanese role-playing games, with support from the legendary Square in Japan. It's a great underrated gem of the mid-90s, but it has since been buried in the collective gamer conscience by three other landmark RPGs that were released in the same year on the same console. Each thing that Secret of Evermore does right, these other games did slightly better and sooner. Starting the game up, the pre-title introduction teases an insidious machine and potentially malevolent machinations in a panning scene reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI. Released a year earlier as Final Fantasy III in the US, Square was still numbering their flagship series incorrectly at this time because the Japanese company hadn't quite decided how to tackle the American market yet. Anyway, as soon as we've named our nameless protagonist, we're whisked away to the fantastical world of Podunk, USA. It's interesting, we're given a date here, 1965 and then 30 years later. I'm not sure though if that comes before or after 1990X. An American development team, an American setting. We now meet a boy and his dog. What could be more American than this? Well, we're then introduced to B-movies. We first see our protagonist leaving a theater, and throughout the entirety of the game, he is referencing film, thereby keeping the narrative light and entertaining. It's clear that the development team was going for an American feel to the game, and that's exactly what parent company Square was looking for, a US RPG built by a US team for a US audience to dominate the US market. But there's another RPG that released on the Super Nintendo just 4 months prior that also addresses American culture as a primary component of its player experience. Mother 2, better known to Western audiences as Earthbound. The Japanese-developed Earthbound actually embraces Americana to a much greater extent, in part because Evermore's protagonist soon leaves Podunk, USA for other worlds. Yet, more surprisingly, Earthbound is more effective in its references to American pop culture. Now, it may be worth noting that originally neither game was particularly well received in the United States. But Earthbound has since seen a sequel, albeit only released in Japan, a virtual console re-release, and its characters have become fairly well known amongst the Nintendo fandom, most notably making appearances in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. It's safe to say that the original Earthbound is a cult hit, and this has moved the franchise forward. It's also safe to say that Secret of Evermore does not have a comparable fanbase. What factors contribute to the potential of a piece of media to establish a cult following? Quotability, eccentricity, and a vein of anti-establishment are thought to be key, and these factors play into the nature of the references utilized in these two games, particularly in how they affect the player. Whereas Earthbound makes direct visual and audio references to pop culture that are often obvious to the Western audience, Secret of Evermore takes the safer route of injecting fictional B-movies into its narrative, which are then quoted or mentioned by the characters. A second degree of separation that dilutes the potency of the reference. No doubt the directness and abundance of the references in Earthbound, many of which are partially obscured and thus reward the extra observant player, enhance the setting of an eccentric America. By comparison, the references in Secret of Evermore, most without any obvious real-world tie-ins, add little to the player's experience beyond providing some levity in trying circumstances. Even the protagonist sometimes gets confused as to why a reference is relevant after he finishes explaining to the player the plot of the made-up movie he's referencing. So why did Nintendo risk copyright infringement to deliver these recognizable references while Square decided to play it safe? It would be troubling to attempt to compare Japanese and American corporate culture in regards to the role of a legal team's oversight in a creative endeavor, or to dig into the competency of Nintendo and Square's respective legal staff in 1995, but it is safe to assume that the American developers working on Secret of Evermore had a better general understanding of the risks of being sued in the American legal system. This likely influenced the writing and development at an earlier stage, particularly because the development team of Secret of Evermore took a democratic approach to design. Looking just briefly at Japanese media suggests that Japanese companies are somewhat more tolerant of the kind of sampling and borrowing that is prevalent in Earthbound. Even after localization and some obvious attempts by Nintendo's legal team to blur the pop culture references a bit for the US release, Earthbound, by comparison, is brazen in its use of borrowed ideas. It seems from this comparison, then, that Secret of Evermore's fictional B-movie reference scheme, which was initially developed as a placeholder but ultimately kept as it grew on the developers, was sound from a legal standpoint but not nearly as effective at eliciting a response from the player and drawing them into the narrative and world. Which is a shame, because in Secret of Evermore there are several worlds to explore, spanning several eras. Yet again, however, there was another game on the Super Nintendo that beat Secret of Evermore to the punch, this time in regards to the setting. That's what we'll be talking about next week on VGology.